today is one of those days, where I just go, I don't have the emotional and psychological strength. I don't have the intellectual acuity to do this job properly. There are soldiers in a hospital. Let that phrase land. There are soldiers in a hospital. And even if the vast majority of you didn't immediately recognize that I'm talking about the fact that Israeli soldiers are in the Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City. Just that phrase, there are soldiers in a hospital. How do you compute that? How do you make sense of that? And the Israeli Defense Force says its mission in Al-Shifa is continuing. Its troops are searching for Hamas terror infrastructure and weapons. Hamas says, the management of the Al-Shifa Hospital says, terrorist infrastructure? We know nothing about that. That's got nothing to do with Al-Shifa Hospital. This is a place that looks after the sick and vulnerable. And increasingly over the last while, as is the case with other hospitals in Gaza, that job is becoming ever more impossible. And you have the head of the WHO saying Al-Shifa is transitioning from a hospital to a cemetery. And you hear about mass graves being dug. And you hear about, and I'm sorry that I'm using this phrase, because it conjures a ghastly image, but you hear that there are dogs feeding on the corpses of the people who cannot be buried, who can no longer be kept in a mortuary because there is no power to keep the mortuary's cold rooms going. And so I try to make sense of this. Okay, what does international humanitarian law, what does that say about this situation? And one of the first sites that I went to was the International Committee for the Red Cross, which gives this explanation, and it was given fairly recently in the last week or so, so it has direct pertinence to what is happening at Al-Shifa and other hospitals. Specific protection of medical establishments and units, including hospitals, is the general rule under international humanitarian law. Therefore, specific protection to which hospitals are entitled shall not cease unless they are used by a party to the conflict to commit outside humanitarian functions and this is a quote, an act harmful to the enemy. In case of doubt as to whether medical units of establishments are being used to commit an act harmful to the enemy, they should be presumed not to be so used. So if there's any doubt at all, then you must assume that they're not being used. I'm not 100% sure, therefore I must treat this medical establishment as not being used to commit acts harmful to the enemy. The expression act harmful to the enemy is not defined under international humanitarian law. This body of law merely singles out a few acts expressly recognized as not being harmful to the enemy, such as the carrying or using of individual light weapon in self-defense or defense of wounded and sick, armed guarding of a medical facility, or the presence in a medical facility of sick or wounded combatants no longer taking part in hostilities. Notwithstanding the lack of an agreed definition, the rationale for a loss of protection is clear. Medical establishments and units enjoy protection because of their function of providing care for the wounded and sick. When they are used to interfere directly or indirectly in military operations and thereby cause harm to the enemy, the rationale for their specific protection is removed. This would be the case, for example, if a hospital is used as a base from which to launch an attack, as an observation post to transmit information of military value, as a weapons depot, as a center for liaison with fighting troops, or as a shelter for able-bodied combatants. All of which Israel accuses Hamas of doing, all of which Hamas denies it is doing. Israel says it has intelligence to that effect. The US in the last 48 hours has said it has intelligence as well to that effect, to which you might respond, how can we trust your intelligence? The Americans, how can we trust your intelligence? Remember, your intelligence said there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And there have been other significant failures of American intelligence. So why should we trust you on this one? Israeli intelligence failed Israel prior to October the 7th, when it did not pick up on what we're told were signals and direct messages from the Egyptian government that something big was being planned. So how can we trust Israeli intelligence on this? But how can we trust Hamas's denial on this? I think it is possible. Whether it's probable, whether it's definitely certain, I don't know. And nor does anybody outside of a small circle of, well, maybe it's a slightly larger circle of Hamas fighters and people within the Al-Shifa Hospital. Whatever your view is on this, you don't know whether Al-Shifa has lost its protection under international humanitarian law because willingly or unwillingly, there are Hamas military operations centered under, around, and in the Al-Shifa Hospital. If you are inclined to believe that the Israelis have given more than enough warning for those military operations to cease, how are you so sure that there are very definitely Hamas operations centered around the Al-Shifa Hospital? Here's another aspect of international humanitarian law governing this. Before carrying out an attack on a medical establishment or unit that has lost its protected status, a warning must be given, which the IDF says has been the case. I don't know, but that's what the IDF says. Where appropriate, this should include a time limit, which must go unheeded before an attack is permitted. And that, again, the IDF says it has done. The purpose of issuing a warning is to allow those committing an act harmful to the enemy to terminate such act, or, if they persist, to ultimately allow for safe evacuation of the wounded and sick who are not responsible for such conduct and who should not become the victims of it. Israel says they've allowed safe passage. Humanitarian organizations say rubbish. There is one exit from Al-Shifa to the south, and if you leave there, you're being fired on. Hamas says they're being fired on by the IDF. The IDF says they're being fired on by Hamas because Hamas doesn't want civilians to leave Al-Shifa Hospital. So how do you make sense of all of this? Other than to go back to the clanging, resonant horror of that phrase, soldiers are in a hospital.